Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this somewhat early for game developers time 11:30 panel. So this is Crafting Experience, Designing Games Feelings First. I'm going to apologize ahead of time if I cough or sniffle or anything like that. I'm just getting over a cold, so I apologize ahead of time for that. So what I want to talk to you guys about today is something that I sort of refer to as feelings first game design. And this is a philosophy that can help you avoid a lot of common pitfalls and time traps during game development. So really quickly, I'm going to just sort of go through what we're going to talk about today. I have a lot of slides, so we're going to try and get through this as fast as possible. So I'm going to sort of describe what I mean by feelings first. I'm going to talk about why I believe that this is actually a really important way to design video games. It's not the only way, but I think it can help you a lot as far as how long you're working on a video game, and then how you can sort of use these and turn these into actionable items that you can use to strengthen the specific feeling that your game has. But first, before we get there, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Harrison Pink. I've been a professional game designer for almost 9 years now. I graduated from Savannah College of Art and Design with a degree in interactive design and game development in 2008. I started my career at a small startup in Atlanta called Thrust Interactive, where we made like advert games, kind of things like this. After that, I started working at Telltale Games. Ooh, that's as fancy as this whole presentation gets, so don't get excited. So I worked on The Walking Dead. I worked on DLC episode 400 Days. I worked on Walking Dead Season 2, and I also worked on Tales from the Borderlands. So my episode of Walking Dead was 103, which was the train episode. So if you remember getting really frustrated trying to figure out how to start the train, that was my fault. So if you love that or hate that, that was me. I was also the co-creator and sort of for about a year the lead designer of Tales from the Borderlands. No, I'm set, thanks. Which means I designed this beautiful boy. I just wanted an excuse to show this concept art. So now I'm at Hangar 13, which is an internal 2K studio. And we just made Mafia 3. It just came out. How cool is that? So let's talk about video games and how cool they are. And you can see from this picture that video games are pretty cool. So you can make there's all sorts of kinds of games you can make. I Googled making video games, and this is the picture it gave me called Horseman Video Games. So there you go. Okay, so when making a video game, for many, many years, there's been this long debate over theme versus mechanics, and which is more important to your video game, which one should you start with, which one is going to inform how people sort of explain to other people if this game is fun or not. If you're not aware, theme is the narrative you're telling your players. This is really fundamental stuff. The setting, the characters, the story, all that stuff. The mechanics are the systems that the player uses to interact with the game, so everything from how a gun works to how to solve an adventure game puzzle, how much health they have, how much health they lose by hitting the ground, if they jump, stuff like that. Now, this debate is not new. If you Google it, you'll find tons of discussions, many varied opinions on which is better to start development with. You start with theme first, you start with mechanics first. This also rhymes with ludonarrative dissonance, but it's a term that we don't talk about anymore because it's sort of fallen out of favor. It's ludonarrative dissonance, if you don't know what I'm talking about. This term came about from this weird feeling this game developer named Clint Hawkins, a very smart guy, got when he was playing Bioshock 1, where you're supposed to make this choice. Does everyone know this game, Bioshock, right? If you haven't, okay, so you know what I'm talking about. You have this choice to rescue or kill these little sisters for resources. And this is supposed to come down to a moral choice versus a systemic what is better for me in the game choice. You have to make this choice about should I be nice or should I be more efficient in this game. But it didn't really work out that way. In fact, it doesn't even matter mechanically because this is a graph of percent difference between killing and sparing the little sisters over time. And it kind of evens out, and you actually get more resources by sparing them over time than you do for killing them, which is supposed to be the hard choice. So it doesn't actually provide that feeling that they were going for. So both sides of this story are important. Theme and mechanics are both very important. One of them allows the player agency in the world. It slowly builds emotional investment in a game. That's the theme. And the other is that's the mechanics, but the other is theme, and that gives those mechanics context. It makes the things you're doing in the world interesting and complex. So it's easy to say red button, green button, which one do you pick? But if it's chop a guy's leg in half or not and leave him to die, that's a really interesting choice, and that comes out of the theme, even though you're still picking choice 1, choice 2. So you have to remember that these themes actual set connotations. They have expectations built into them. If you say you're going to make a game set in space, most people are going to assume you're going to get to fly a spaceship. Not all games do that, but you have to understand that there's messaging inherent in the theme that you're picking, and just be aware of that when you pick it. So there are lots of games that skew heavily towards one side of this sort of theme and mechanics slider, and one way or the other way. Games like Dear Esther or Gone Home are almost 100% thematic. There's almost no mechanics, or if any mechanics, other than walking in these games. And then there are games that obviously skew heavily to the other side, like Go or chess, and that's almost entirely devoid of theme, other than two sides are having a war, and it's almost entirely mechanical. There's nothing wrong with that, okay? Those are both super useful ways of looking at game design. Good, I'm glad that animates. But I think it's actually missing a really important part of the puzzle, and I think that part is what I refer to as feeling. And it changes the relationship between theme and mechanics. So as a game developer, your goal is to provide a specific feeling to the player. Other media like movies and television and books do that through the theme alone, but games are blessed and cursed with interactivity, and you have to use that and utilize that and understand that that's a part of game development. You have to fulfill that promise. So interaction is sort of an entirely new dimension, right? You go from 2D, which is just theme, to a 3D. It's an entirely additional piece of the puzzle you have to understand. And you have to learn how to manage how all of those pieces work together, and where this is how feeling can come in and make this a lot easier for you. So if you decide on a feeling you want your player to have before you decide on it's an FPS, it has zombies, you can craft things in it, you're going to get to the specific feeling you want your player to have much faster. Can everyone in the back hear me? Am I being loud enough? Okay, great. So what do I mean by feeling? That's a kind of a squishy term, right? You can just sort of describe a lot of things by feeling. How you run and jump and collect coins, and how fast you move in a platformer. That's a feeling. How you move and shoot, and how the gun fires in a first-person shooter. That's also a feeling. But I'm not really talking about fun or any of those other things. Fun is a very complicated sort of thing to grasp. There's lots of really intelligent people who have written a lot of things on like what fun is and how to describe fun. Feeling and fun are somewhat connected, but I'm not going to touch on fun today. There's some really great links, and I'll have these links up at the end of the presentation that you can read and at your own discretion. Feeling doesn't also guarantee fun at all, which I'll also touch on later. So to me, what I think feeling is the emotional reaction a player has to how tangible a game experience is. And honestly, you don't even have to bother writing that down. It's a super smug way of saying the player feels in the game the way they would feel in the real world doing those activities that are represented by your game's mechanics. So in Alien Isolation, you're terrified, you're alone, you're being hunted by some unseen force, you're hiding in a claustrophobic space, and that feels like how you would feel in real life, hiding in a claustrophobic space. It really emulates that feeling very strongly. Same thing with Minecraft. It makes you feel like you're crafting something, you're building something out of what you have lying around, you're surviving by your own wits. It goes deeper than just fear or happiness or anger. It's a combination of things that make you feel like, yeah, this is what I really would expect this experience to be like if this was real, if this was a real thing I was really doing. So I'm going to quickly walk through some feelings, and then we'll identify some games that push that feeling very hard. So here's one. The player feels like they're struggling to keep a society from collapsing. They're spinning multiple plates and never have enough time or resources to feel safe. There's plenty of games that make you feel this way, right? There's Civilization, XCOM is a great one, and board games like Pandemic. Here's another one. The player feels like they can't trust anyone, even their allies. Betrayal could be around any corner. Tons of games make you feel this way. Werewolf, The Resistance, Battlestar Galactica board game, and if anyone's played Neptune's Pride 2, which will destroy your office if you bring this into the studio, this is another one. So here's a third one. The player feels alone and alienated. They're all by themselves and must use their wits to make any progress. So games like Another World or Myst, where you have no one else around you, no one can explain what you're doing, you have to figure it out on your own. These games push that feeling really hard. So I think we all get it. We all understand what I'm talking about now when I say feeling. I hope so, because I don't have any more slides to explain it. But why is that important? Like, why is this feeling specifically important to making games? So if we remember this is an issue that could have been solved if we know the feeling we want. In The Walking Dead from Telltale Games, we knew the game's thesis was going to be, what will you do with the time you have left? Or sort of simpler, how will your choices affect those around you? Or you can make it even simpler and just say your choices matter. So we knew that this license, Walking Dead, was about characters making choices and living with those consequences, good or bad. So that's what the game focused on so heavily. I hate this picture. I'm sorry, it's so pixelated. If you can see that, that's a choice that you have to make in the game to save one or two of these very pixelated characters. This is when you first realize that your choices have serious and permanent effects and consequences on the story and the other characters in the game. Now, these characters don't give any mechanical advantage over one another. You don't get more resources for having one character or unlock a new piece of story for another character. But they do affect the story and the characters in it for multiple episodes. They change the things that other people have to say, and they change your relationship to the story, your main character's relationship to the story, for many episodes. It also goes to what we call the core fantasy. So this is something that most games that have story really focus on, not so much games like Tetris, other than the core fantasy being I'm really smart. The core fantasy of these games is, in Walking Dead, it's being a survivor of a zombie apocalypse. And it really is just, what are you asking the player to pretend to be? What role are you asking the player to sort of embody? And it's a question that in games that have a really rich story, you ask a lot. Like, what are we asking the player to embody here? Come on. So the core fantasy is not actually the game's feeling, but they're very, very closely tied together. The core fantasy being very strong will actually help you push a stronger feeling on the player. So feelings-first design focuses on the emotional response of the player above all else. That's the most important thing to remember here. So let's say, for an example, your core fantasy, the feeling you want to push is, I want to feel like Spider-Man. If you know that that's your core feeling, you force the very next question in your development cycle to be, how do I do that? How do I accomplish that? You know right away you don't need to do it this way because you're making a Spider-Man game, not a Batman game. You save a lot of time that you would have spent otherwise building a bunch of Batman mechanics and testing them out to see if they're fun to play if you hadn't already asked the question, how do I accomplish feeling like Spider-Man? So focusing on feelings before all other things allows you to focus in on what your design needs to be. It helps you avoid false starts. It sort of unifies the vision at the conceptual stage. This is something I spoke on a panel about yesterday, is making sure everyone on your team understands the vision early. Focusing on the feeling that you want to push can really help you do that early. Wow, that's cool. It helps you inform the thematic and mechanical choices that you're going to make down the line. And it helps you understand your core fantasy. Just wanted to mix it up, So back in GDC 2015, a guy named James Lance, who was the lead developer on a game called Invisible Inc., he works at a company called Clay Entertainment, gave this really great talk, and I think you can get it online. He talked about the difficulties of developing this game. This is a sort of turn-based tactical stealth game, but the way that they built the mechanics made it just feel like another XCOM clone. You didn't have to be stealthy. It was completely disincentivized. You could get shot, you had health, you could shoot back, you had big guns, and this was not the feeling they wanted the game to have. So what they did was they scrapped it and they put on a whiteboard, what does it feel like to be a spy? And they asked that question at the top of the whiteboard, and then underneath it they answered it with all the things they thought it would feel like to be a spy. So they changed things. For example, you get shot once in that game, you're dead. That's it. There's no health. It re-incentivized and refocused the game on stealth, and it sort of helped them figure out what is the goal, what are the mechanics and themes we need to use to sort of push the specific feeling that we're looking for. Now, if they'd started their development with that on the whiteboard, they could have avoided all that time spent and all those hours burned trying to make a game that wasn't anything like what they wanted it to be. It would have helped them close down a lot of doors really early. And you're going to spend a lot of time wasted going through doors you don't need to if you don't have that question asked and answered early. So another thing that feelings-first design will help you do is find motivational parity. What do I mean by motivational parity? Well, it's basically the player and the player character in the game have the same motivations and the same desires. And the player and the player character have the same methods of obtaining those desires. You need to get those as close as you possibly can when you make your video game. So to truly project themselves into a game, the player and the player character, the avatar, they have to care about the same thing, right? If at any time the player doesn't care about the same thing that the character does, it becomes impossible almost to emotionally invest in a game. If you come across a character who says, "Oh, please help me, my village is on fire," and you're like, "I don't give a shit about your problems, man. Like, I don't care. I don't care about saving your town from evil." You're not emotionally invested in the game. So remember that you can make your characters care about whatever you want them to because they're not real people, but you don't have that luxury with players. Players are actually real people, despite what their comments on YouTube would say. So start with the motivating feeling you want your player to have, and then just get your character to care about the exact same thing. In this example, Lee loves American history, but your characters might not give a crap about American history. Luckily, this doesn't affect the story at all. As in the earlier slide, Lee also loves Clementine, and we want the player to love Clementine. If Lee didn't love Clementine and the player did, we have a real problem. So the reason is this, right? There it is. Player feels motivational parity with their character. The impact of the feeling that they have in that game gains a lot of impact. It helps successfully communicate that feeling to the player. Now, it's really important to remember that the narrative of your game is always going to be more flexible than the mechanics of your game. If one needs to move, the narrative needs to move. At the end of the day, it's an interactive, it's a game. It's not a movie. It's not a book. The game has to be fun, and if that means the narrative has to take a hit, that's what has to happen. If Lee needs to be able to make a choice in the game that lets you branch and the sort of beautiful story that the writers crafted becomes slightly weaker because you need the player to have that choice, the player needs to have that choice. Agency is more important. Same thing in Mafia 3. If Lincoln needs to have a choice to do one thing or the other, and the story has to accommodate that, but it makes it slightly weaker, you have to allow for that because it's a game. So back in the day, motivations were really simple. Getting people motivated is really tough, actually. There's a reason that when games got their start, the motivation was just to kill things and not die. Galaga, asteroids, missile command. It was just kill lots of stuff and don't die. And there's a reason for that, because survival is a super, super strong motivator. We understand it really, really. We as human beings get not dying as a thing you want to do. We don't have to even think about it. It just sort of comes in on a very primal level. Fight or flight, like your brain just clicks on and you do what you need to do to survive. Because of that, the work you have to do to get people bought in on surviving in a video game is a lot easier. It's a super primal, super strong emotional response. And it's actually great that these games use such a strong motivator because the average playtime was like 2.5 minutes. They expected people to play for about that long. So you don't have hours and hours of gameplay to get people invested in the pilot and his family and all the things he cares about, and you can't feed his son and his daughter's sick. You don't have time in 2.5 minutes to do that. So sort of just survive. That makes perfect sense for a game that only lasts 2.5 minutes. But games have gotten more complex over time, right? And because of that, motivations have also gotten more complex over time. So kill or be killed games still exist, but we get really fatigued very quickly if that's the only thing that's in the game. You need something else to allow for more motivational parity, much more deeper connection with the avatar. So we've gone through design focus, we've gone through motivational parity. Now we're going to talk about this tone blueprint, and this is mostly useful for making games based on existing licenses, which is what we did at Telltale a lot. It can help you take sort of complex mechanics. There we go. Complex mechanics and sort of focus on their individual moment-to-moment feelings. This is really useful when your tools change, when you're going from a board game to a digital game or going from a shooter to an adventure game, et cetera, et cetera. Your tools will change, but the feeling you're going to try and get out of the player needs to remain the same. So in The Walking Dead, what is the tone of that? We came from the graphic novel, not the show. So what was the tone of the graphic novel? What does it feel like to live in the world of The Walking Dead? What does it feel like to live in the world of BioShock? How does that make the player feel moment to moment, like a 30-second chunk? So we worked on an adventure game called Tales from the Borderlands, and it was based on a shooter called Borderlands 2, which I'm sure you've heard of. So we had to distill down the core feelings of Borderlands 2 and make sure we were able to replicate those feelings in an adventure game. So feelings like it's an extremely hostile world. Everything is trying to kill you. There are guns just literally all over the ground in that game. You play with your friends. You can play single player, but the game is known for being a multiplayer game. There's this sort of gold rush theme and imagery in the game that's very prevalent. Greed sort of pushes everyone in that game. You know, your buddy picked up that gun before you did, and like you really wanted to kill that boss to get that gun. Everything in that game is about greed. And there's no one that's really good. Even the good characters are not super altruistic. They have their own sort of things that they're trying to accomplish. And even the bad guys are super entertaining, right? Handsome Jack's a super entertaining character, and he's the bad guy. So we knew that, it's an inclusive world. There's a lot of different types of people from different backgrounds, different sort of sexualities, different body types, different beliefs that all come together in this world, and it's really open to a lot of people, and that was really important as well. So we know that we didn't have the luxury of these mechanics to make our game. This is the shooter stuff. We're not going to do the shooter stuff, right? We didn't have that. So what we did is we said, well, let's get the feelings that they're accomplishing, even if we don't have those mechanics, and use our mechanics to accomplish those same things. So we didn't have playing with friends, but instead we turned that into two sides to every story. This is a game that you play two protagonists and they swap off telling the story. So we get this feeling of multiple people together telling a story. No one is truly good. We turn that into an unreliable narrator. So as the characters tell the frame story that is the game, sometimes they'll lie a little bit and change the details, and you never know if exactly what you're seeing is really what really happened. And we turned Extremely Dangerous World into, your characters aren't Vault Hunters. And Vault Hunters are the protagonists of the Borderlands game, and you can just kill hundreds and hundreds of people and not break a sweat. But our characters are just average people. One skag, one bandit is enough to kill them and scare them, and that makes you really feel the same way that you would in Borderlands. Instead of 100 bandits causing you to feel that way, we use one. So we worked on The Walking Dead, and we knew that if the players didn't care about taking care of Clementine, the entire idea was just going to be sunk. There's no way that this game's going to work if you don't care about Clementine. All of these decisions in the game about forcing players to make these decisions revolve around the fulcrum of this little girl and her safety. The story takes place in a group of people that are all crazy. And any human being that had any smarts would be like, I'm out of here. I'm not staying with these crazy people arguing all day, waving guns at each other. But Clementine had to be a compelling enough reason for Lee to stay so the player would not feel like, why am I not leaving? This is stupid. Lee, you're not acting like a real person. So much of the story is devoted early to getting to know Clementine personally, getting to know her personality, but also making her good to be around and enjoyable to be around. She's useful from a pragmatic point of view. The first thing that she does is she tells you to be quiet so the zombies don't find you. And the second thing she does is give you a hammer to save your life from a zombie that's got you on the ground. Now, I don't want to focus too much on The Walking Dead, but like I said, this entire idea of this game would not have worked if this feeling had not been a very focused one. So all of Lee's actions are motivated, and hopefully the player is on board with what you do. Spoilers, by the way, if you haven't played the game, but I hope at this point you have. Everything the player wants to do matches what Lee's willing to do because of the strong motivational parity, right? So the ultimate win is when a player knows what they want to do before the option comes on the screen, and then they see that option on screen, and they're like, fuck yeah, I want to do that, even if it's making an old racist asshole eat human meat. So, yeah, woo. We got a lot of metrics back about that choice. It was like 99% of people picked that. It was like unusual, yeah. So game design, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is basically just applied behavioral psychology. It comes down to observing and making sense of human expression and interpretation. Why do players act the way they do? Why do they do what they do? Why do they enjoy what they do? This is the pyramid of needs, if you don't know it. It's just a psychology thing. You can find it online. This is basically what game design is and where it sort of intersects with psychology, right? Like all the things I'm giving you fall under the umbrella of understanding players, understanding who they are, why they do what they do, why they enjoy what they do. And if you follow the advice that I'm working through today, it's going to help you learn the specific language of having a communication, having a dialogue with your players through the game. The more you make games, the more you observe people playing games, the better you're going to understand human behavior. And that's kind of the point of being a game developer, a game designer. So during BioShock Infinite, during the development of that game, the developers really wanted Elizabeth as their sort of like sidekick character to feel as real as possible given the constraints of the technology. And they spent a lot of time looking at psychology. They spent a lot of time looking at things like where are people's eyes when they are listening to you versus just hearing you, like you're talking at them and they're not actually listening to you. Their eyes will look at different things on a person's face based on that. And they put that stuff into the game because they really wanted this stuff to really hit people and resonate with them on a psychological level. So I could sit here for hours and talk about this stuff. I'd love to deep dive into that, but I can't. We don't have the time. But the specificity of the medium, which is interactivity, means you have to understand how that interactivity affects players and what players want to do with that interactivity. It's the reason that I love making games myself. It's a way for me to more deeply understand human beings and what it means to be human and how we as a society communicate with each other. All right, so all the mushy stuff done. Feelings-first design can also help you with elegance of design. So Mark Rosewater, well, we'll start with this. The game is not done when you can't put any more in, but when you can't take any more out and still have it function. I'm sure you've heard this before. This is one of those things that just gets tattooed on your face if you're a game developer. You just think about over and over again. It's a very common expression. So you know your benchmark is. If you can achieve the feeling that you're looking for, if you're setting out to achieve, that's the only game stuff you need to put in your game. Mark Rosewater is the head designer of Magic the Gathering, has a really great quote that is, the goal of the designer is not to outwit your tools. It's not to show off what a great designer you are. You're not designing this game to show off how smart you are as a designer. You're designing this game for people to consume and enjoy. So what do I mean by that? Well, I wrote this blog post a while ago about the relationship that I believe that elegance and engagement has in video games. So the post is, the super TLDR version is, if you have an elegant system, it encourages a deeper level of emotional engagement by a player because you remove all the stuff out of the way that can trip a player's brain up while they're trying to play the game and get emotionally invested. It pulls them out of that state of flow. And while doing this and while sort of preparing this talk, I realized that feeling and the elegance of design are actually really tightly intertwined. What do I mean by that? Well, if you start with the feeling you know you want the player to have, it's super easy to chip away all the things that don't push that feeling. It helps you identify the sort of load-bearing pillars of your game and what is important and what isn't important. It helps you identify when to say yes to the player and when not to. So all the things in Walking Dead, we wanted to say yes to the player as often as we could, right? We didn't have to say yes to this, right? Lee's not going to blow up a farmhouse with C4. He's not that kind of person. We didn't have to build mechanics to support that sort of player choice. He's not going to, put all these crazy batshit options into the game. We don't need deep shooting mechanics. We don't need all of those things because that's not required for the feeling that we wanted the game to have. It kept things really, really elegant. Okay, so that's why I think that stuff's really important. So far this has been pretty theoretical, pretty academic, high level. Let's talk about actionable. Let's talk about what you can do to create a strong feeling in your game. So the first step is, why do you want that feeling in your game? That's the first thing to ask yourself. Think about why you want it, right? And it's really important to remember that there's no silver bullet answer to this question. It really comes down to what you want the player to feel. And this is, once you figure out the feeling that you want, you've written it down on the whiteboard, start thinking about ways that your theme and mechanics can start supporting each other. I talked bad about theme versus mechanics earlier, but once you have that feeling established, now's the time to start figuring out what your theme and mechanics are and how they can work together. So, you can travel from feelings to theme and mechanic very quickly once you know the feeling that you want to get. It helps inform what the theme and what mechanics you should be using early. And you can hop back and forth from these as often as you want. You can bounce from, I'm going to work on the story, and then I'm going to bounce to mechanics, and then, I've got figured out a mechanic, and that informs the story again. That's totally fine to do, and that's how most games get developed, as long as you keep the core feeling in mind. So here's a quick example from Magic the Gathering. Now, you don't need to understand how this game works. If you're not a Magic player, that's okay. The basic premise of this card, Frozen Solid, is if you cast this card, you put this card on a creature on the table, that creature can't do anything, can't attack or block or do any of its cool abilities while this card is in play. And if that creature takes any amount of damage, that creature dies. So we have the theme. The theme is being turned into ice, which is presented to the player through the name of the card, Frozen Solid, and the card's art. It's pretty obvious what this card's about. You also have the mechanics supporting the theme by saying this creature can't move, this creature can't do anything, and also the smallest amount of damage will destroy the creature. So the end result is this piece of game mechanic, this card, that really makes the player feel like their creature has been turned to ice. So Mark Rosewater sort of, again, notes that familiar themes can help compartmentalize the interplay between complex mechanics. Make sure that the theme and mechanics reinforce each other and they're not conflicting with each other, right? Be prepared to cut anything that doesn't push your feeling. You don't need it. And as I said earlier, the familiar themes will help players compartmentalize complex mechanics. What do I mean by that? Well, it's just a process known as mental chunking, where the brain takes a whole bunch of stuff and then just remembers it as one thing. It sort of compartmentalizes lots of stuff and makes it one thing, and remember that one thing is a unit. On average, a human's brain can only hold about 7 pieces of information at once, 7 or 8 pieces of information at once. So instead of having to remember 7 birds, you just take that and say, they're all birds, and that's much faster for the brain to come up with, to remember, my mistake. So here's another quick example of a Magic the Gathering card. This is a guy, this is a creature, and he has this ability called flying. And if a creature has flying, another creature can't block it unless it also has flying. And that's really easy to understand. You just get that, right? I'm on the ground, the creature's in the air, it flies. I can't reach the creature unless I also fly. You don't have to do any mental heavy lifting to get that. It just happens. Your brain just gets that immediately. It's also called resonance, which is just a fancy word for saying a mechanic that provides a strong feeling that players relate to quickly and easily, right? You know, it's the same reason we understand what a med kit in a game does, what a health potion in a game does. You don't have to think about it, you just know how that stuff works. And it's not just because we've all played hundreds of games, it's because the mechanics of being healed match the theme of the medical bag. The theme is just inherently understood based on how we as human beings understand how the world works, right? Understanding how the world works is important. It seems really simple, but we all follow a similar logic on how the world is built. It's sort of built on instincts that we as a society have shared in our experiences of living on this planet. You cannot fight human nature. If you fight human nature, you're going to lose that battle, right? You can try and say, okay, well, in my game, fire heals you, because, okay, fire can cauterize wounds, it can sterilize things. That's not false. But that's not the first thing your brain jumps to when you think of fire. You think of things like this. You think of a whole bunch of other stuff before you think of any sort of healing effects. And in fact, this is a direct opposition to healing. Look, players will play the game the way you tell them to play it. It doesn't matter if it's not fun. If the game says to bang your head against the wall to win, they will do that. They will play it that way. But they're not going to have fun. You're not making them have fun, you're making them fight their own human nature, which is not to bash your head against the wall. You have to remember that when you're building a specific feeling into a game, you're not dealing with logic, you're dealing with emotion. You're dealing with intuition, and you need to find the shortest and straightest line to get that feeling to the player. I'm not saying you can't put twists on the relationship, but you need to understand it's really, really dangerous and really hard to pull off well. So it's a two-way street. This is not just a one-way thing. You have to watch for mechanics also getting too abstract, because that's going to start causing friction and make the player feel less of that fantasy that we discussed earlier. So here's an example. Let's say you're making a game themed around playing a powerful baroness. So here are the mechanics of the game as you've designed them so far. You gain wealth by sending your peasants off into the field. The mechanics revolve around rolling dice, and that will determine what you can do that turn. And then you pay resources to place your peasants on the field. So here's the problem. The mechanics that you've designed aren't really supporting your theme. Why is a powerful baroness subject to the whim of the random number generator? That doesn't make players feel powerful. Why is she paying peasants to go work in the fields when they should be paying her, right? That's what being a baroness is all about. The mechanics aren't supporting that feeling of being a powerful person. So let's sit out for a second and say, okay, let's step back and say, well, what does it feel like to be a powerful baroness? What is the core fantasy? We can figure it out a lot faster, right? We say, okay, well, you have a lot of money, and that gives you a lot of power. Your subjects do what you tell them to do. You have control over them. And you're going to receive tribute from those of lower status. With these bullet points, we can figure out mechanics that match the theme we're going for a lot faster, right? So in the previous example, we sort of altered the mechanics to fit the theme. But again, like I said earlier, you have to understand that the theme is always more flexible than your mechanics. So the relationship is important, but it doesn't have to be 50-50. It can be 80-20, it can be 20-80, it can be 90-10. The end goal is always creating that feeling. So Gone Home is a game that successfully provides that Home Alone feeling, kind of creepy. You don't know what's going on. You've been out of the house for a long time. Nobody's there. The design is super elegant. They only built the things they needed to build for that feeling. They didn't have a complex health system. They didn't have a complex inventory. It's a simple inventory, a simple map. They only used what they needed. You need to be prepared to pull anything that isn't supporting the feeling that you're going for. You have to learn to let it go. I'm really glad you all get this reference because this is old. This is an old reference. It's really uncomfortable to do that, but you have to learn to do it because you'll always find another place for your idea. Put it in your back pocket. You will find another game that will fit in. I've spent years with a mechanic in my back pocket, and then finally to go, oh, this is the perfect place for this. That's okay. It doesn't mean you're a bad designer. In fact, it means you're a smart designer, knowing, even if you're in love with this, like this is your baby, this mechanic, but and you're smart enough and introspective enough to know that this doesn't fit here, that actually makes you a stronger designer. You have to question if your mechanics help push the feeling. Another thing you can do is try and sort of think about how gamers consume your game versus how a developer consumes content. And luckily, there's a system that can help you do that. Several years ago, this paper was written called Formal Approach to Game Design and Game Research, MDA. It was written by Robin Huneke, Mark LeBlanc, and Robert Zubek, and I probably just butchered all their names. You should absolutely read this. It's only like 3 pages long. It's super, super, super valuable. I'm going to run through the sort of super quick version of it right now, but I think you should totally read this. It's required reading. So I'm going to totally butcher this, but the simple version is the mechanics. It's MDA, mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics. The mechanics are the rules affecting the player as well as the player's agency in the game. The dynamics are the specific thematic examples of the game affecting the player, and the aesthetics are the tone and the visual messaging of the game. And so the designer's perspective is to kind of go in this direction. You start with the mechanics that sort of informs the dynamics, and then you end up with the aesthetics. But the way that gamers consume your content is the exact opposite. They're going to consume the aesthetics first, then they're going to feel the dynamics, and then maybe they'll figure out the mechanics from there. So to go back to my earlier example, we talk about alien isolation. The aesthetic is terror. That's the feeling that you want your player to have. The dynamics of that are fear of the dark, fear of being alone, fear of being asphyxiated in space, fear of being stalked or hunted by something you can't see. And the mechanics that make that happen is a quick moving alien, there's darkness, there's cramped spaces, right? So this is what we've been talking about, right? Mechanics is obviously mechanics, dynamics is the theme and tone, and aesthetics are that feeling, right? And that's really important. That third piece is so super important. Okay, it's bummer time. It's time to lay some hard truth on you guys, right? Feeling on its own, no matter how strong, does not guarantee a fun experience. You have to make sure that the player wants to do the things you're asking them to do in the game. Even if it's a super strong feeling, you have to ask yourself, does someone want to put themselves in this situation? And ask yourself why they would want to do that. Here's an example. Monopoly. Raise your hands if you actually genuinely like Monopoly. Okay, nobody. Great. Oh, okay, fair enough. But if you did, you probably haven't played it in a long time, and when you did, you're probably the banker, and you probably cheated, and you probably won, right? So, right. But here's the thing, Monopoly provides a very strong feeling of wheeling and dealing on the properties market, right? You're creating and maintaining monopolies on housing, you're trying to exploit those monopolies, you're buying properties and trading with other players for more properties and sort of trying to edge someone out financially. It really does feel like building a monopoly in that game. But the problem is that Monopoly suffers from something that's known as a positive feedback loop or a causal loop. And Wikipedia just says it's the process that occurs in which a feedback loop in which the effects of a small disturbance on the system include an increase in the magnitude of the perturbation. That is, A produces more of B, which makes more of A. So the super simple version of that is, I land on my buddy Pat's properties, right? Because of that, Pat gains a bunch more money. Pat now has more money to buy more properties, and now my percent chance of landing on Pat's properties increases percent-wise. Doing better in a game makes it easier to do better. That's a really easy trap to fall into in a game. Games need catch-up features so that if you're doing worse, you can catch up, instead of doing better, making it easier to win the game. Monopoly, you play Monopoly, and after 30 minutes, it's pretty obvious who's going to win that game, but you keep playing it for the next 4 or 5 hours anyway. Now, if other players still felt like they could win, maybe Monopoly would be fine. If you could figure out a way to fix this sort of a causal loop, maybe the game would be fine if you can sort of change the core mechanics. All right, so I'm going to quickly recap everything super quickly. It's so cheesy, I'm sorry. All right, so feelings first design is focusing on what you want your players to feel first. It's not simple emotions like happy. It's deeper things like I can't trust anyone. I have to rely on my own wits, et cetera, et cetera. You treat it like your design North Star. If you write this on a board and show this board or PowerPoint presentation at your every single design stand-up, every single company meeting, whatever, and remember, this is what we're trying to do. This is the goal of our game. It will always help you stay on track and help you make cuts of things you don't need. So to create strong feelings, you make sure that your theme and mechanics are always relating to each other. You place feeling above all of those things, and don't be afraid to cut. There will always be another place for your idea. And consider approaching the game aesthetics first instead of mechanics first. Remember that this is how players are going to enjoy your game. Feeling first design is important because it helps you cut directly to the core of what tools you need and what tools you don't need. It encourages you to see the game from the player's perspective. And it promotes motivational parity between the player and the player character in the game. Don't forget, strong feeling is no guarantee of fun, and Monopoly still sucks. Thank you very much. So I think we're going to open up. We have some time for questions. You can clap. That's fine. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I think we have some time for questions if we have a microphone. We could probably just hear if anyone has any questions you want to ask. Put your hand up. Question over here.
When you first got the word that you're going to be working on the Borderlands IP, when I first heard about Telltale making a Borderlands game, it was really how are they going to do that? How did you look at that and overcome that?
So the question is, how did we even begin working on a Borderlands adventure game based on a shooter? And I'll tell you exactly what I thought. I also thought, what the hell is this going to be? I have no idea how we're going to make this game. I tried to figure out, like I said, the core feeling of what Borderlands makes the player feel. And I sat down. It was just me and another guy in a room saying, what the hell are we going to do? And we decided that the game should be about greed. And we did a lot of research into sort of Gold Rush movies and stuff about greed. Treasure of the Sierra Madre is the movie that we really, the whole original pitch for that game is really the Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which is a fantastic movie. You all should watch it. And from there we started figuring out, okay, well, if this game is about greed, what is the core thesis? And the core thesis that I came up with was what does greed do to you? Do you descend into Humphrey Bogart madness? Do you rise above it and say, well, no, my friends are more important? We started coming up with mechanics that really pushed that feeling. One of the early mechanics that wasn't able to make it into the game for many reasons was we were going to have unlocks for Borderlands 2. So you would play the game, you'd unlock a special weapon or a special skin or something that you could play in Borderlands 2. And I really pushed to have those tied to choices that you made in the game. So an example would be, if you decide to punch Kenny in the face, you can have this really sick sniper rifle. And then you have to ask yourself, am I willing to hurt a person I care about for material gain? And that's what it feels like to be greedy. That's what that greedy choice feels like in real life. And I wanted players to feel that way and go, yeah, it's worth it. I really want that cool sniper rifle. So you punch Kenny in the face, and he's mad at you, and that's what happens in the game. And then you'd see someone playing in Borderlands 2 with that sniper rifle, and you'd know you had to punch Kenny in the face to get that rifle. You're a real jerk. And obviously that stuff wasn't able to make it into the game for many reasons, but that was the kind of thing we started working on. It's how can we make this game about greed? Okay, well, we took a while to get there, but you go to a vault and you have lots of money, but there's multiple people that want that money, and you're fighting other people for that money, and that story sort of just came out of that. But it was because we all figured out early, what is this game's thesis? What is this game about? How can we make a story that feels like you're in the Borderlands and motivated by the same things that the characters in the real Borderlands are, but in our version of the game? What tools do we have in the presentation? What tools can we use to push those feelings? So I could talk about it all day. You can corner me later and ask me Borderlands questions if you want. Anyone else? Questions? Yep.
How much time do you spend in general on the whiteboard and using words and thinking about the feelings before you get into the aesthetic sketching?
So the question is, how long do you spend working on the feelings and writing on a whiteboard and coming up with stuff like that before you start actually working on a game? That can be really different based on the studio you're in. at Hangar 13. Obviously, I came onto the project when all that stuff had already been figured out. So when I was working at Telltale, you spend a lot of time on that. That's the pre-production time that you have. You have to come up with a really great story and pitch it to the executive staff and make sure they're all on board with it. So you spend a lot of time. I probably spent 6 months or more just trying to come up with the season story and tweaking things based on feedback and really are we actually getting the feeling we want across here. And it never stops. Like even when you're making the game, you start playing it and you're like, oh, this isn't really pushing the feeling I thought it would. Let's change it a little bit. Let's tweak it a little bit. So there's no point at which you stop thinking about that stuff. Even working on Mafia 3, if I'm working I'm a world designer on Mafia 3, and I'm putting content in the game, I'm still thinking about like what is the feeling of playing, what is the feeling I'm trying to get the player to feel while I'm putting stuff into the game, while I'm adding assets to the game, and playing it and playing it and playing it and playing it, and making sure that that feeling comes out. So that still can sort of persist on into the development phase as well, and honestly, even to the end of the game, that whole thing is like, are we hitting the mark? Are we hitting the pillars of the game early? That's something that never ends. Over here.
Yes. When you designed Tales from the Borderlands or any of your Walking Dead games, did you use the MDA framework when designing your game, or did you try to use another one that fits more of your adventure style, like an FDD format?
Right. Sure. So the question is, when working at Telltale, do we use the MDA approach? And the answer is not really, because Telltale has a very specific style of game that it makes. The M part is kind of already taken care of because we know the mechanics we're going to have. And we tried to push it. We tried to add some new mechanics. There's some new stuff in Tales from the Borderlands that previous games didn't have, and that the newer games that they're working on since I've left have newer stuff too. But we don't push it that far at Telltale. So the mechanic part was kind of figured out. It really came down to like, what is the story? How can we use the mechanic, like the toolbox of things that we know we have? How can we use that effectively and push the feeling in the story that we're trying to get across? So we didn't really use MDA because the structure has already been established. It's now just how do we use that formula, tweak it a little bit, make some new stuff, but really just push this new story forward. Anyone else?
When it comes to feeling games and like promoting that kind of feeling, how do you get the player deeply invested in the game, like in the first 2 or 3 minutes?
You can't. There's no way. You can't.
Deeply invested. How do you get them to want to continue?
You start with a pragmatic thing, and you give it time. There's no way to cheat emotional investment in a game. A lot of games these days like make you a dad, and you have like a kid, and you're like, well, you care about them because you're a kid, and you're like, no, I don't give a crap about who. No, it's not real. You like. Family took you years to care about your family. Like that's not an instant keyword to make you care about anything. So you can't shortcut it. The way that if you notice in The Walking Dead episode 1, or if you look at the season of Walking Dead, the early choices you make, and I don't know if this is like a choice you made on purpose, but it just like worked out that way. The early choices you make are to keep your character alive. You don't really focus on saving friends until about halfway through that episode or near the end. We don't really ask you to take care of Clementine that hard until like episode 2, or to make difficult choices based on that till episode 2. It starts out with the most pragmatic, like I just want to keep playing the game. I don't want my main character to die because that means the game ends. And we slowly ramp you into emotional stuff over time. So there's no way to say you can be emotionally invested in minute 2. That just is never in a million years going to happen. So start out with an intriguing story or a mystery or something that goes, oh, I don't know where this is going, but this seems cool. I'm interested to see what happens. Lee starts out in a cop car, and the first thing the guy says is, so I guess you didn't do it then. And you're like, what are you talking about? And you got like handcuffs on, and you're like, what is happening? It's intriguing. You want to know more. You're not emotionally invested in any of it yet, but you still want to see where this is going. And then over time, you get emotionally invested in Lee, and then emotionally invested in Clementine, and then emotionally invested in Kenny or whoever else. But it takes time. You can't shortcut it. So start with pragmatic choices that the player can make. I want to stay alive. I want to keep people around me that are powerful to keep the game moving forward. And then over time, you can slowly squeeze it towards like the emotional stuff.
Okay, and one quick thing also, is that why in Telltale Games you always said this person will remember that, or this person will do that, or this person will...
That is the so and so will remember that is so that you know that the game is listening. I was actually a vocal opponent to putting that into the game early on, and I was wrong. I think that it really helped the player realize, like, no, the game is listening to every single thing you do, and it matters. It all matters because when a player starts a new game, they go in like a newborn baby. They don't know what the rules of that world are because every game has different rules. So they poke at the game and they sort of figure out the rules the way that babies stuff stuff in their mouth to like figure out what it is. And players don't assume any rules until you tell them that that rule exists. So if we had said nothing, the player would just assume, like every other game they've ever played, they can make dialogue choices and no one really cares, no one's going to notice. But because our game had another rule that they didn't realize, we had to tell them, by the way, this game is different from other games you've played. This stuff matters. That's why it's all there. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
If somebody wants to do what you do in terms of designing games, what skills do you think they need to have? What kind of career path would you suggest?
So the question is, to do this kind of thing, this kind of game design, what kind of skills and tools and experience should you have? Some of the best designers I work with came out of QA. Some of the best designers I work with came out of studio operations assistants, which are like they order you food at meetings. I don't think that you don't have to have a 4-year degree. You don't have to have an architecture degree to make games. I think that's it's a muscle you stretch like anything else. I would recommend, if you want to do this kind of thing, to just make tons of games. And I say this anytime anyone ever asks me for career advice, it's just download Game Maker, download Unity, whatever, any free program, and just make as many games as you can. They're mostly going to be bad. That's okay. Like, I've made tons of bad games that I won't show anyone. But it teaches you how to take an idea from idea all the way through execution. And it teaches you, like, oh, the assumptions I had in the idea phase where I thought I was super smart aren't actually how the game's working. And that's super valuable, and that you will make better games over time. I mean, I can look at early career stuff and look from it now and be like, oh my God, it was terrible. Why would I ever do that? And they shipped it. Weird. But, I don't think that I can't give you specific, like, go to this school or learn this thing. Programming is always good to know. If you have additional skills, those are always useful. If you can be a one-man or one-woman shop to build your own thing, that's really useful. I'm not great at that stuff, but I was lucky enough to get a job where I didn't have to do that. But the more you know and the more skills you have, that will always serve you well. But really it comes down to the experience of making a game, because you can make as many game design documents as you want. You can have as many great ideas as you want, but it's not really useful or worth anything in the world. Making a game and knowing that you can fix the engine on a car while the car is moving, that's what is really valuable on a game designer.
And will that get you past HR?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, HR is just going to look for keywords and see that you have experience. Once you get your resume on someone's desk and you have a link to a bunch of games you've made, they're going to play your games and go, oh, this person's really cool, we should bring them in and talk to them. And that's when you can sort of talk about games intelligently. You can say, this is why I solved this problem, and they'll put you on a whiteboard and have you solve some stuff on a whiteboard. But really, they want to see that you understand games and you've made something fun. This is fun. They made a fun thing. Bring them in. Let's see what they have to say. So that's what I'd recommend.
My concern was more, how do you get to the point where your resume's on somebody's desk, and how do you...
I put it everywhere. I went to GDC 2010. I tell the story a lot, and this is 100% true. I had a bag full of resumes, and I gave my resume out to every single company at the exhibition hall. Every single company, even ones I wouldn't want to work for, like mobile studios or whatever. I gave it to every single one, and Telltale is the only company that called me back out of the hundreds that were there. Cast the net wide. Take any job they'll give you. If they pay you to come in and make the coffee in the morning, take that job. Like I said, the guy that ordered us lunch is now a designer that I work with all the time, and he's talented as hell. So if they give you a foot in the door, doesn't matter what it is, QA, don't be too proud to take a job anywhere. And then once you're in the door, then your skills will take you the rest of the way. So, anything else? Anybody else? Questions? I saw a few hands in the back. That room's shy. I don't want to say anything.
Yeah, so this is all very interesting. I love it, but I'm a CS major and heavily into programming. So in the games industry, are there positions that kind of blend heavy programming and design, or do you have to pretty much choose?
I can't speak for the entire industry. I think that smaller studios that require you to wear multiple hats is probably the right place for that kind of thing. If you want to be a game designer and a programmer, you can also, if you have the means to do so, become an indie developer and make your own thing. If you can code your own thing and you have that talent, then you can just be a one-man shop and make your own games based on if you agree with this method or not. You can make your own games. You don't need a designer to do that for you. I would still recommend starting with a game design doc and trying to figure out, like, all right, what's the core of the game? What are we trying to accomplish? What's the objective? Like, what's the one-sentence explanation of the game? But if you're a CS major and you can do that stuff on your own, then you should just do it on your own if you have the means to do so, or join a studio that only has like a couple people in the office, and you can wear multiple hats and do multiple things. Yeah. Anybody else? Last chance. Okay, great. Thank you guys so much for coming.